Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2022. This is a BookTube event created by Vin at Revenant Reads, where we're reading Star Trek books for August and September. August being the standard canonical Star Trek of Gene Roddenberry. So the original series, The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise, and all the stuff that springs from there in terms of movies and whatnot. And then September will be Strange New Worlds, where we'll be reading stuff that isn't that. Stuff that's not directly connected to the crews and the vessels of those canonical shows, whether it's set in the Roddenberry universe. There are plenty of things that are. Even Peter David's Excalibur books are set in that universe, but they aren't strictly canonical, or whether it's literary representations of the so-called New Trek, the new shows that have come out since J.J. Abrams' Kelvinverse movies. Sort of a bright white dividing line. You have Star Trek Discovery, Star Trek Picard, Star Trek Lower Decks, Star Trek Prodigy, and Star Trek Strange New Worlds. So 5 things, most of which have not generated many books, if any. I don't know that there are any for Star Trek Prodigy, for instance. That's what September will be. But for August, we're still reading the what I call the real Trek. Of course, I would call it that. I was a Star Trek fan from the very beginning. And I've read a couple of Star Trek books this week. This week has been sort of, for Book Trek, has been sort of all over the map. I've read a couple that I really liked, a couple that didn't do anything for me at all. But one thing that I've been doing in August is going back to old favorites of mine. And I wanted to do that, even though I've technically already made a Book Trek video for today. I did a starter kit of Pop Science. But I wanted to do a book-related thing as well. And I did reread a Star Trek book last night. I went to my physical books. I went to the printed books instead of ebooks and reread something that I have read I don't know how many times since it came out in 1978. I read it probably 20 times in 1978 alone, and then I've just kept returning to it. And it's this. It's Star Trek, The New Voyages, Volume 2, edited by Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreth with this beautiful cover art. I already did a video about Volume 1. And I went and reread Volume 2. My Volume 2 is in terrible shape. Not as terrible shape as my Volume 1, but still pretty bad. And it's an anthology. And Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreth were the first to call for mainstream. This is Bantam, mainstream published science or Star Trek fiction. So they got flooded with submissions, people. Everything under the sun. Mainly because the Star Trek fan fiction world before these books had been hugely prolific. Every kind of Star Trek content imaginable was out there in some fanzine or other that you could get before the internet. So they had a huge variety of stuff to pick from, and it was too much for one volume. So they did a Volume 2, and how much I wish that they had done a Volume 3. What I wouldn't give. When you talk about, on BookTube, we always talk about books that you wish existed but don't. What I wouldn't give, we had 20 volumes of Star Trek The New Voyages, all edited by Marshak and Culbreth, who are original fans. They are true believers, breathless true believers, and they have a very particular writing style of their own. I did a video about their book, The Price of the Phoenix, but it's unmistakable. You could take their name off anything they wrote and know immediately who you were reading. And this has quite a bit by them, more than it seems. Because the first story in this anthology is called Surprise, and they share the writing credit with Nichelle Nichols, who just recently died, who played Lieutenant Uhura. I don't think Nichelle Nichols did much writing of this story. I'd be willing to bet a Boston cream pie that it was all our editors who did that. But it's a neat story, very much in their way of doing Star Trek, which is not the right way anymore. It's not the current way. It's very much a pre-lawyers way to do Star Trek. Lots and lots of sexual innuendo. Lots and lots of, suggestive scenes that you wouldn't. And one of the lawyers vetting your book for in a Star Trek fiction today would cut it out without even asking you. They'd just plot it right out. Jim Kirk in mesh Speedo. No. Jim Kirk and Mr. Spock making thinly veiled sexual innuendos to each other? No. No. Get rid of it. Or we'll get rid of you. There are a million writers behind you who will do this without your making a fuss, so don't do it. And also another thing that Marshak and Culbrecht tend to do is amplify every minor character. Suddenly, McCoy is a galaxy-class chess expert. Suddenly, Kirk and Spock are galaxy-class chess experts. Suddenly, Uhura is the greatest person in the world, and so on and so forth throughout all of that. You don't mind. It's done with such obvious, glowing affection that you don't mind. And this is set along the same lines as Star Trek: The New Voyages, only the introduction is much longer. The book is longer, but the introduction is much longer because of the success of Star Trek: The New Voyages. It was so successful. They were flooded with fan mail about their own book, and they wrote about that in their introduction. And the introduction is very, very touching. Has all sorts of touching moments where they talk about. Let's see here. Let me if I can find an example. They talk about some of the things that their fans have written to them. Curiously, every single story was in that first volume was ranked as the top favorite by a substantial group of fans, and some were blockbusters. Mindsifter was one of those blockbusters. Most people that wrote in ranked that as their highest story. You've been saying that the funny stories were funny. Quote, I laughed until my jaw ached, and the serious ones touched you and moved you, sometimes to tears. From a professional woman who gave a professional quality analysis of the stories, quote, I will tell you right now that I used up 3 Kleenex on one story. A male physician writes to us stiffly, you have the honor, if one can call it that, of being the first to make me cry. A 70-year-old female who gave a startling, thoughtful analysis, starting with a bang. Wow! I feel as if I just was stunned with a phaser. You could have knocked me over with a feather, or as Mr. Spock would say, the horny epidermal outgrowth of a bird. In case you're wondering, I just read Star Trek: The New Voyages. I won't say whether or not a passionate letter like that was sent to these two from the middle of nowhere in Iowa, but they got tons and tons of those letters. And they write about that in their introduction. Then they get on to the business of the stories. And in any anthology, the stories are uneven. These two were passionate Star Trek fans and chose a wide variety of stuff in here. There's a story in here called Cave In, where it's a dialogue between two people who are trapped in a cave, and you don't know who they are. The gimmick of the story is that the speakers are probably Spock and McCoy. The banter between them seems to be about the same, but you don't know from minute to minute which speaker is which. And that's kind of the gimmick, and as you can tell, that's a neat gimmick for a fanzine. It doesn't really work as a story, and it doesn't work in the story. I didn't think it did in 78, or 79, or 80, or 85, or 89, or 90, or 91, or now. And there are a bunch of other stories in here that, for one reason or another, I think get bogged down. Snake Pit is one such story in here that doesn't work. For me, the standout story in here is by Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbrecht. It has a disastrous title. It's called The Procrustean Petard, which refers to two sort of idiomatic references. One is the bed of Procrustes from Greek mythology, a monster who would entice travelers to come to his inn, and if the bed was too short for them, he would cut off the parts of their legs or arms that were over-jutting the sides, and if it was too big for them, he would rack them until they fitted. So it's not a hospitable bed at all. And a petard, of course, means hoist by your own petard, hoist on your own petard, where something you build for yourself ends up hurting you. It's a dumb title. You could have come up with any better title in the world, but the premise is fascinating. Again, a pure example of something you could not do today. Paramount, Bantam, whoever would stop you immediately if you tried to tell a story like this, where the Enterprise is lured to a planet by the Klingons, Captain Kang, to be specific, to ancient, abandoned, advanced technology that captures them and does something to them. A few members of the Enterprise crew, it resequences their bodies along the opposite chromosome arrangement from the ground up. So they're still the same person, but their gender is the opposite. And that very much includes a stunning, dirty blonde knockout James Kirk. Comes out of the process as a beautiful woman. And Marshak and Culbrecht examine the hell out of this premise, including an Enterprise crew person who realizes that he's more comfortable the way he ends up than the way he was originally. Long before this became any kind of a social issue. But the main that's a tangent. The main thing is, I think, in the story, it's a little bit hammy. Everything these authors wrote is a little bit hammy. But the main consideration, I think, is Kirk coming to grips with the fact of how much being a man, just physically, muscles, but also in terms of the estimate that other people give you on sight, that how much being a man helped him in his career. And what extra challenges he would have had to face if that had not been true. I think when Marshak and Culbreth were writing this, the standard Star Trek idea was that there had never been a female captain. Maybe even no one had ever reached a high rank in Starfleet, let alone been captain of a starship. We had that retconned out of existence in Star Trek Enterprise and in even Star Trek The Next Generation. So that was not an issue, but this was written long before those incarnations of Star Trek. And it is a fascinating story. It is fun and fascinating in what happens to them. There's also a story, what's it called here? Yes, there's a story called The Sleeping God by Jessica von Puttmacher, who was a liaison with NASA. And Marshak and Culbreth spent a good deal of time in their introduction talking about NASA, defending it passionately for it had recently undergone massive budget cuts and been relegated out of its relevance in terms of the good old days of the moonshots. And they were outraged by that. You can see the personal outrage in the introduction that they didn't like that those voyages are the beginning of the fantastic future world that they love more than the present. If you cut off the funding for those voyages, you're endangering that future world. They start off with a very good anecdote about how they were part of a petition to President Gerald Ford to get the first reusable space shuttle, renamed Enterprise, and it worked. So there was a rollout ceremony. A whole bunch of the original cast was present. The original Star Trek theme was swelling as this vessel was rolled out, called Enterprise. And like Star Trek: The New Voyages, this second volume ends with a poem. And since I read you the original poem, I thought I would read you. I thought I would read you the other one. This is called Soliloquy, and it's by Marguerite Thompson. And as with the first one, which was look back on one episode of Star Trek, this is a little bit cringy, is what we would say in the 21st century. My father gave no word of love to me. My mother practiced laudable restraint. My Vulcan childhood lessons logically prepared me to despise the human taint. I could not blame T'Pring, that is the woman that Spock is affianced to when they are both children. They are mind-linked to each other. Unless you talk about Star Trek Strange New Worlds, in which case they've been having a buddy-buddy, hot-cold rom-com fun event for the whole of their lives. Kissing and canoodling and cavorting in public. And I think at one point being seen drunk in the fountain of the Ritz-Carlton. We'll get to Star Trek. We'll get to New Trek next month. I could not blame T'Pring. I saw that she let flawless logic over pledge prevail. For she would stop at nothing to be free, wisely to mate a pure Vulcan male. I want to point out, I don't mean to belabor the obvious here, but I want to point out the fact that Spock is half Vulcan had nothing to do with why T'Pring rejected him. And Marguerite Thompson is an original Star Trek fan. She ought to know that. She didn't care that he was half Vulcan. She cared that he was a legend, and she did not want to become the consort of a legend. And she also cared that he would be gone all the time. He wouldn't be around at all. That's why she favored Ston, not because Ston was a full-blooded Vulcan. But anyway, human tormentors do not understand. Acknowledgement of feeling causes pain. Cruelly subvert defenses I had planned. Plot to anesthetize my watchful brain. And then the final couplet. What will they find when I am ripped apart? I love you, Captain, written on my heart. Right here. And that, I won't stress it too much. It's there from the beginning, literally from the beginning, in the story Surprise, at the beginning of this story. But also it's quoted in a lot of those reaction fan letters that people got, is that you really show the loving friendship between Kirk and Spock. And that is true, but what's shown in a lot of the stories in that first anthology, and that's what's shown in Surprise, and what's reflected in that poem, goes a few steps further than deep friendship. It is one of the last dying echoes of some of the more overt content of the fan fiction world that Marshak and Galbraith came from. It's handled well in here. It's not overdone at all. I think that Star Trek: The New Voyages, the first book, has more hits than misses, and more hits than that are in this volume. But the stories tend to be longer. They tend to be more complicated, and that's good. There are a couple of gimmick things in here, but one of the stories in here, for instance, is in the form of a screenplay. But I think that was an intentional thing on the editor's part. I think they were going for a large amount of variety. There was a long running Star Trek anthology series called Strange New Worlds that hopped from incarnation to incarnation and didn't do that. Its variety there was in which show it's adapting, not in the forms of the stories themselves. I don't think, if I remember correctly, the Strange New World series went on for like 20 volumes. I don't think there's any poetry anywhere in it. and certainly no slash fiction. That was the old Star Trek. I loved those stories, but they are long gone. And this was pretty much their last gasp. So that's my Book Trek book for today. We have just a few more days left of the Wrath of Book Trek, the old recognizable Star Trek. We have only a few days left of that. Then we move on to virgin territory, to unexplored territory. When I talk about Star Trek on BookTube, I am used to speaking from a deep well of experience. Like I say, I was a fan of this show when it was originally broadcasting on TV, and have followed it ever since. But when I watched the first J.J. Abrams Star Trek movie, the Lens Flare movie, I was entertained. I was involved. But I think it was 5 minutes old before I said, all right, this isn't Star Trek. I don't care what these characters are called. This isn't Star Trek at all. And the movie makes that clear. Abrams makes that clear, that this is an alternate timeline. And he makes it clear in the most immediate way possible, because we get our Mr. Spock, played by Leonard Nimoy, coming to this alternate timeline. So we have two Spocks. So there you go. And if you do that, then, Bob's your uncle. You can tell me any weird story that you want, and I'll watch it. Although, that doesn't excuse how dumb the J.J. Abrams movies are. They really don't make any sense from literally minute to minute. Just in terms of plot, even if you weren't a Star Trek fan, you'd still be saying, what? but the Star Trek incarnations that have happened after that, I am incredibly unfamiliar with. I've watched them, most of them. But I've read virtually nothing set in those worlds. So I will have to load up on the Star Trek fiction from those Strange New Worlds, but not yet. Not yet. A little dispiriting to see all these BookTube channels sort of bidding a fond farewell to August events of all kinds when August isn't over yet. I'm going to keep plugging along on Book Trek until midweek. So I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.